Hello, and welcome to the Knowing Show. I am so happy to be here with you all. I am eager to talk about how to move through the process of effectively cleansing our bodies, our souls, our spirits from the toxins like the lymphatic system does. And y'all, there's a lot here when it comes to this process of cleansing. There's something about being stuck in our emotions and then consequently having our emotions block our cognitive ability and then preventing connection. So those are the three kind of problems that we're really going to be addressing tonight. And the reason why this is so incredibly important is because we were made for connection. We were made for the ability to sit alongside another human in their lives and in our life. But if we don't know how to effectively allow for the cleansing of our souls, we will have this buildup, this buildup of what should be discharged and that which is waste. And it fundamentally prevents connection. Just like how when there's a buildup in our lymph nodes and in our lymphatic system, we end up getting sick. And so over the last couple of months, actually, I've really been learning a lot about how our brains really can kind of flush and go through its own cleansing cycle. And I learned about this actually today, that the brain, like the lymphatic system, has its own cleansing system. And what it's called is called the lymphatic system. And this was only discovered in 2012. And because it's so recent, so many of us haven't learned about this. There's something about it that it's like, okay, well, what's the point of doing a deep dive? The point is that you need to maintain certain habits and rhythms in your life to allow for the brain to go through the proper cleansing of toxins and waste like the lymphatic system does. Otherwise, in our brains, we build up that what should be discharged. And what they see in terms of the research that they've been doing ever since this term lymphatic system was deemed in 2012, they find that more and more folks are suffering from neurodegenerative diseases and Alzheimer's, dementia. And so by way of us understanding the lymphatic system and how to effectively cleanse the brain, we then can hopefully prevent some of these diseases from coming upon us and coming upon those we love. So this whole process of the lymphatic system, the glymphatic system, going through this almost like natural healing cycle, I had this thought this afternoon. The last 2 days, for whatever reason, I've just been feeling super off. And I'm like, what is going on? And yesterday morning, I had this moment where I was like, well, let me just change my environment. I think that will help. And I got in my car and I was driving to my favorite little coffee shop. And I just had this recall. I was like, oh, gratitude is a choice. Okay. And then I just started singing. And I know that in singing, it actually releases endorphins, which are similar to when you go for a run. Endorphins are released, which just kind of boost your dopamine and your happiness levels. So thank God for that. So that was really helpful in that moment. But then throughout the rest of the day, it was still a little bit of a challenge to kind of get out of the funk. And then this morning I woke up in a very similar way. And I was just like, what is going on? Like, why am I so not feeling on an emotional level, kind of how I normally do, which is my ability to choose joy typically lends to the rest of my day unfolding and really changing to be in accordance with that. But it was weird. It was like this morning, choice wasn't enough. And I was sitting there this afternoon and I just realized that I really hadn't moved through some of the grieving process. This Sunday would have been last Sunday, the 31st of August was my, what would have been my 12th wedding anniversary. And I just hadn't really let myself grieve that. I had talked about it, processed it, but there wasn't like an emotional, physical release. And so I want to lean into that because the three problems primarily that we run into when our emotional system gets clogged and stopped up, our lymphatic system manifests, and when it doesn't have the release it needs, we get sick. And in the emotional level, when we effectively get clogged and blocked in our emotional system, we end up experiencing disconnection. We end up experiencing just that feeling of being stuck and depression. And we're like, what is happening? And then frankly, it then impacts our cognitive. It's almost like it starts from within and moves up. And it's just like impacting every part of our body. And in the book, The Body Keeps the Score by no, I'm not Peter Levine. He wrote another book that I'm actually going to reference here in just a minute. Bessel van der Kolk. He wrote The Body Keeps the Score. And what he found was that our body stores the emotional impact of something that's traumatic that occurred out there that maybe we witnessed or that we felt. So our body recalls social rejection just like how it would recall a physical accident, let's say. And so if we're never moving through these emotions, it's just building upon building upon building all these layers that then effectively we're stuffing down. And then finally it overflows into rage or anger, or honestly, sometimes it can even be just this well of grief or sorrow and ignited by the smallest little thing. And you're like, how did that upset me to this degree? You know, you look at the instance and you know it's maybe a 2, but your reaction is an 11 on a 10 scale. And it's like, what is going on? And so with this whole conversation around the lymphatic system has its process of rinsing, recycling toxins and waste. The lymphatic system for the brain has its process of getting the toxins out. But what about our emotions? And Peter Levine, I just referenced him a moment ago. He wrote this book, and actually I'm holding it now, Sounds True. And it's all about trauma. And I started reading this while I was in Italy 2 months ago. And he's talking about this example of a polar bear. And a polar bear is running, and these scientists are chasing it because they want to pay attention, do some, I don't know, experiment on the polar bear, I guess. And so they're chasing the polar bear from their helicopter. The polar bear is running. They shoot it with a tranquilizer. The polar bear immediately is shocked and falls to the ground. Then he wakes up in a cage. And then he starts all of a sudden moving his arms and then moving his legs. And then the entire polar bear is effectively convulsing within the cage. And over the course of about 5 minutes, he slowly starts to calm down and return to stasis. And then when the scientists actually slowed the video, they saw that the movements of the polar bear were moving in rhythm, and he was effectively completing the chase. And so after completing the chase, he then could return to stasis. And you see it with a possum who is, you know, being picked up in his mouth by a coyote. And then the coyote puts him down thinking he's dead. And then the coyote runs away to like go get his family to come, let's eat this thing that we caught. And then the possum gets up and leaves. But he's not freaking out. And you see this with deer, you know, same thing there with in Africa, in the plains of Africa. A lion grabs the antelope, got him in his teeth. He got him in his teeth. And the antelope, what would normally be, which is a traumatic moment, the antelope lies down, the lion leaves to go get his family and his folks to come in and then enjoy the kill. The antelope just gets up and trots away. So how is it that these animals can return to stasis so fast? And what Peter Levine has found in his study around trauma is that through the physical release and moving through the emotion, it allows for the system to effectively unload everything that it's been holding rather than just the stuffing and suppression of it. And in knowing, I actually talk about this example because when I read this, it just completely, man, it added so many layers to my own journey of knowing myself, because while so much of this work is actually coming to know and understand emotions, how to ensure that they're not the ones in control of us, but that our true self is in control. We understand our emotions. We're intelligent to them, emotional intelligence. But there's still an element where we actually need to work through the emotions that are arising within us, lest we continue to suppress and suppress and suppress. And then at some point, they're just going to build up and overflow. And so what I have found personally, as well as with others that I've been working with, is the emotional release allows for us to complete the traumatic cycle rather than having it be stored in our bodies. And so I have Peter Levine's book here. I want to read to you a little section that he talks about. So he says, although humans rarely die from trauma, if we do not resolve it, our lives can be severely diminished by its results. Some people have even described this situation as a living death. So why can't we shake off the immobility response just like the animals do? What's to stop us from releasing that frozen energy? And he says there's good news here. But in order for us to do this, we have to move out of that frozen state. And it can be a fiercely energetic experience. Without a rational brain, animals in the wild don't give a second thought. They simply do it. When humans begin to move out of the immobility response, so for so many of us, when we have a trauma response, we freeze. Just like how the opossum, he falls limp and pretends like he's dead, and the antelope, same thing in the mouth of the lion, they freeze, and then they continue on in the traumatic release of that by way of effectively their limbs flailing or going crazy, and then they can move out of that. But going back to what he's saying, when humans begin to move out of the immobility response, however, we are frightened by the intensity of our own energy and latent aggression, and we brace ourselves against the power of these sensations. This bracing prevents the complete discharge of energy necessary to restore normal functioning. Undischarged energy is stored in the nervous system, setting the stage for the formation of the symptoms of trauma. And y'all, this is what's wild. What happened in that traumatic moment was just isolated to that moment. But if we don't actually go through the emotional discharge of all the emotions that were created in that traumatic moment, our body thinks that we're still in a state of trauma until we go through it. It can be 20 years that effectively our nervous system thinks we are in fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode in response to whatever trauma that was. And so this is why it is so critically important that we learn how to engage with our emotions. So kind of like engaging number one is this process of actually having that emotional and physical release. And what that has looked like for me, y'all, is actually literally tears, like just letting myself cry. And so today I realized that I had this emotional buildup over the last week, ever since what would have been my 12th anniversary. And I never really let myself feel it. I was processing it logically, but there was kind of an emotional buildup over the last few days that effectively was really preventing my ability for my cognitive brain to be able to really even be fully activated in my life over the last few days. I've felt like I've had this like little bit of a mental fog. So that's one manifestation of emotional suppression is mental fog. I've actually felt a little bit more lonely this week than normal. And that's another way of the manifestation of emotional suppression is disconnection from other people. And so what is the cost of emotional suppression? It's lack of performance, lack of connection, and ultimately lack of not just connection externally, but also internally. There's something in us that needs to be tended to if we don't pay attention. And so with this whole process of completing the trauma cycle through the kind of the physiological response, so that can be by way of emotional release, even like deep breathing, just allowing myself to breathe deeply in a moment of extreme discomfort and just letting that help the emotional discomfort within come out through breathing and breath work. I've heard emotions likened to a tunnel. And if we don't move through the tunnel, we stand at the beginning of the tunnel. It's before us. We already had the thing happened that caused the emotion within us. And we're standing at the edge of the tunnel and we're like, don't want to go in there, because what Peter Levine says, we are terrified, like by our own intensity of the reaction, and it doesn't logically make sense. And so animals can move through their traumatic cycles like that because they don't have a rational brain. So there's this delicate balance of effectively allowing our logical and intellectual intelligence to step aside. And with intelligence, I have allowed myself, I know what's going to happen. I have intentionally, with emotional intelligence, said, there's some emotions that need to come out. I'm going to literally sit here and allow them to come forth. And it's effectively, we're still in control of our bodies, but I know that this is going to be a big reaction and I just need to let it come out. And I've actually warned some people close to me and been like, I actually am trying to learn how to cultivate this tool and learn how to, it's a tool, right? That's a very logical way to put it. But I'm learning to cultivate this ability to move through emotions. And y'all, I believe, I don't know how many times I've shared this, but I've shared this, I believe, one time. I experienced this before I even knew what the context was about this emotional release from pent up emotional suppression that effectively releases us from the traumatic memory. I was on my couch I think it was about 3 years ago. And for 7 or 8 years, I had always ignored the day which my brother-in-law was killed. It was October 5th, 2014. And I just never went back to it in my memory. I never went back and revisited the details, never went back and relived it by any means. What's the point? And so that day effectively haunted me. It would come to memory, and sometimes, and it would just like startle me, catch me off guard. And I was like, no, I can't deal with it. And so it was haunting me. And so I was about 3 years ago watching a film, and there's this scene where the husband is lowering the casket of his wife into the ground, and they're at the gravesite. And I was immediately taken back to the day of Nate's burial. And all of a sudden, I remembered that I did not call my sister on the day of Nate's death. And that I just started weeping on the couch, like in a very, it felt intense, right? Like Peter Levine says, there's something in us that's afraid of the intensity of our reaction because it feels out of control. And I just was weeping. And I was like, I cannot believe I never called her. But because I had emotionally suppressed it, I also suppressed the memories and suppressed what actually happened. And so by way of allowing for almost like taking the lid off of the emotions suppressed and allowing them to bubble forth, we also release the ability to remember. So that's where, when we have so much emotional suppression and we're like, man, there's parts of my childhood that I just can't remember, that feels like a blank slate. Well, it's because there's been emotional suppression there. So then the question is, well, what are you suppressing? What's hidden in the past? What's lurking there that may come out at some point or another? Y'all, our body flushes and rinses and releases toxins and waste. And we have to be able to do that for ourselves on an emotional level. So the first way that we do this is what Peter Levine talks about in terms of just allowing the emotional overflow, allowing for the processing and the release of that traumatic moment, which is literally crying if you need to, shouting if you need to, allowing just for that to come out. But what's cool is that there was an experience where I had to talk through something with someone I loved that was close to me. And I told them, by the way, I just read Peter Levine's book. I have a feeling that I may have some emotions, and I'm trying right now to not suppress them. And I need to let them out, because otherwise my body is going to store this as a mini T moment. And when I say small T moments, it's effectively a small traumatic moment. Anytime that our body feels a sensation and we shut it down and lock it down and suppress it and put a lid on it, we're not allowing it to release. And thus the body stores it as a mini trauma, as a little T. The big T moments, the big traumas, the car accidents, the deaths, those are so evidently a trauma that we will go to therapy for those. But all the little T moments along the way, on almost a daily basis, those moments turn into and become little T's in our body that we hold and trap inwards. So now if let's say I look at my friend Joe, for all of the moments that I have not allowed myself to process something emotionally within me that maybe Joe said or did or hurt my feelings about or rejected me in a certain way, I now, when I think of Joe, when I see Joe, my body tightens and locks up, because I've got all these little T moments suppressed that have yet to be worked through. But if I intentionally in the moment, I'm consistently moving through the emotions. And again, little T moments probably are not going to have a big emotional response, but just like, oh, wow, I didn't like that. Taking that deep breath and moving through it. It's coming out. It's no longer stored in my body. And now Joe is free. Joe's human and he's probably going to make a mistake. And I'm human and I'm probably going to make a mistake. So if we have the promise within relationships, hey, I would like permission to move through an emotion. And it's so important, y'all, that we recognize that what happens right now in the present usually is rarely tied to the present moment itself. Usually it has ties all the way back to the past. So then the question becomes, have we done the work to intentionally go to the past, free ourselves of that, so that we're not attacking people in the present moment when we have improper attribution to why the pain is there in the first place? And so with this whole concept of cleansing the soul, it's not just knowing how to do it in the moment. One process is by way of literally allowing that emotional release, telling people around us, hey, this is the manner in which I want to go about engaging with you in relationship. It might be kind of intense. Are you willing to do this with me and give me space to just cry if I need to? It may not make sense to you. Is that okay? That's huge. The other way is by intentionally going to the past, understanding the big T moments, and then also unpacking little T moments that have threads and ties into the present. Because otherwise, apart from this intentional pursuit of releasing emotional suppression, that is going to sit in our driver's seat, in our subconscious, apart from us going in and doing the work to do the releasing and the flushing of it, just like our lymphatic system and lymphatic system. So the other way that I have found to be so effective to move through what has been emotionally suppressed is by way of vertical alignment. This is every single morning I sit and I give space. Today I actually intentionally gave myself a lot of space to just listen and lean in. I didn't actually have a big emotional response today. There was a time when I was like, oh, I think I actually need to cry around my marriage. And so I actually sat down instead of just, feeling the emotion. I actually wrote out, I just gave myself a little prompt. I hate that. And I just was like, I hate that you left. I hate that you didn't fulfill your promise. I hate that I feel sad. I hate that, you know what I mean? And just writing out and letting the subconscious flow, because otherwise all of that's trapped within us. But this is what's exciting. Once it's released, we're free. Once it's released, they're free. And so it might need to happen a number of times based on the degree of hurt or pain. I read this by Peter Levine that I just wanted to, I think I can find it. He effectively says that the degree of pain is almost in proportion to the relationship of the person. So to be betrayed by someone that was supposed to protect you is absolutely devastating. And in reading that, I felt like I actually had some permission, like, oh yeah, it makes sense that this is still painful 4 years later. It makes sense that it's still hard. It makes sense that I've got reprogramming of my subconscious to do, because so often that fear that we held about someone, for example, my husband leaving me, it just preyed on the fear that I had when I was a little girl of not being wanted or loved, not being desirable. And so that's ultimately who I need to tend to. That little girl who was at the altar at 20 years old, left at 28 years old. And it's like, man, she's got some tending to do. And it makes sense that it takes some time. Now, there's so many, I've heard about this analogy, which is just so beautiful, about effectively grief being like waves. And over time, the waves and their crashing is more spread out and spread out and spread out. There was about 2 years after losing Nate where every single day, actually it was about 3 years, I thought of him every single day and just carried this grief. And I actually carried it and wore it like a badge. So that's a big difference than 2 or 3 years after my husband leaving. And the way that I engaged with both of those losses, one is the dismantling of your future. The other is this life is literally lost. And it is so incredibly unfair and so incredibly devastating. But y'all, people don't talk about grieving the living. My husband's still here. He's still alive. And so how do we grieve these people who took away what should have been pure and wholesome and holy, even whether that's in childhood, our parents not being who they should have been, looking back on the past and saying, wow, like that is really devastating that my dad left. That is really devastating that my mom was an alcoholic. That is really devastating that I was raised by my grandfather. whatever the story is, it is so important that we grieve it, because those people who promised to protect us, those people who were supposed to protect us, the betrayal of that, they carry and hold in our bodies memories that, even if we're not consciously thinking about it, they're deeply embedded in our subconscious. And that subconscious holds a lot of power over the reins of our lives. And so just like our lymphatic system and our lymphatic system allow for our bodies and our brains to be cleansed and rinsed, literally rinsed, of the toxins and waste therein, we need to do this with our own souls. And that comes through vertical alignment. It comes through the physical expression of what's inside us, and ultimately us ourselves, giving our souls the safe space, the arena in which we can go and do the work, to do the processing, to do the healing. And what better thing than if we have a partner or someone alongside us who can help us move through that process, because it is so hard, it's so painful. And to actually be held through that time is, man,